I tell you what, it's not like the olden days. I'm Jake.
I'm Rosie.
And this is our podcast on Goodnight Sweetheart, a BBC sitcom which aired in 6 series from late 1993 to early to mid 1999. Like several other things we've talked about, it was one of those sitcoms that our parents were watching in the evening, prime time, BBC One, that we got interested in and joined in with. And I remember by the time of its 6th and final season in 1999, I don't think the parents were that interested in it, and the BBC weren't as interested in it as they used to be, because it was moved to Sunday, 6:30 tea time sort of slot, rather than big ratings-grabbing sitcom during the week. But I always used to look out for it in the Radio Times and hope that they were going to make enough series to get to the end of the Second World War and finish it off properly. And whatever shortcomings it may have in the details, it certainly did that. It's a sitcom about time travel. When Elizabeth Carling, who played Phoebe number 2, first read a script, it seems that she came away thinking it's a sitcom about a bigamist, which I suppose is not inaccurate, but I think the main hook, and certainly what attracted me to it, was the time travel aspect. But yes, the main character, Gary Sparrow, played by Nicholas Lyndhurst, is a time-travelling bigamist. At least in the second half of the show, he's a bigamist. In the first half, he's just a time-travelling extramarital affair haver, evolving into adulterer by the closing stages of Series 2. I'm not sure if it was conceived as a vehicle for Nicholas Lyndhurst. It's not one of these things like The Thin Blue Line where you've heard that other people were considered or wanted for the main part. And a lot of the humour in the show does come from Nicholas Lyndhurst reacting to things, which, as the BBC were well aware by 1993, is very funny because, as we found out from an Only Fools and Horses documentary, it had been discovered during that show that if you put Rodney reacts in the script, Nicholas Lyndhurst injects appropriate humour into whatever scene is going on with his reaction, the specifics of which are not something that can be scripted. Gary Sparrow is certainly an anti-hero. He's the main character of the sitcom, the protagonist, I suppose, but he's doing something very uncertain morally, if not definitely reprehensible. But we are supposed to be in it with him and like him in some ways, go on the journey with him and understand where he's coming from, sympathise with his feelings. Although the fact that he is rather self-centred, thoughtless, having his cake and eating it too, with little regard for anyone else's feelings, conveniences, finances, practicalities, is also a major part of the show that we can laugh at times, but also feel disapproving of Gary for. As you would expect, Nicholas Lyndhurst appears in all 58 episodes of the original series, and so does one other actor, Victor Maguire as Ron Wheatcroft, Gary's best friend and helper in his time-travelling adventures. Ron is a master printer who creates fake ID, wartime currency, white fibres, as well as moral and practical support covering for Gary. We've mentioned Victor Maguire on podcasts before as a very good comedy actor, and he is. He's one of these actors who can get humour even out of some quite bad material, and makes us laugh a lot when he gets some better material to do something with.
When we were children, we both had Ron as our favourite and wanted to see Ron and get a laugh out of Ron, didn't we?
Very much so. And in many ways, I think, when we watch the DVD, we still do. I bought that DVD set when you'd been watching it on ITV3, who'd bought it to show in the afternoon. there was an announcer introducing Goodnight Sweetheart as wartime fun, and then it cuts into the present day, some characters doing a play. Out of context, that wouldn't seem like wartime fun at all, but it does flick back and forth between the 1940s and 1990s rather seamlessly once you're used to it, and I think, certainly as younger viewers, that was something that was always very fun about it, and unique. It's not really from the sitcom pool. It has things happening that happen in sitcoms, like the main character has 2 dates on the one night and that sort of thing. But there's always a unique feel to it.
On the DVD, there are some comments by the writers on the very first scene, among others, but in this first scene they say, looking back, we think this scene is a bit too long, with Gary and Ron meeting for the first time and they have to introduce themselves, which does tell us their names and that Gary's wife is Yvonne and she's on this open university course with Stella, Ron's wife, and from there, Ron, as far as I remember, next hears Gary on the radio calling in with a strange experience about having travelled back in time and goes to ask him about it because he is very open-minded and interested in the possibility of any strange things happening. Actually, that reminds me of all people of Alexandra Milman's character in The Tomorrow People, on the lookout for things that are beyond what we know. And actually, I think that works quite well, but at the same time, when I first saw that, I was quite surprised, because having picked it up from Series 2, it always seemed like Gary and Ron had a long-established friendship, and that was the reason Ron was Gary's confidant, because he was his best and oldest friend.
Yes, that very much surprised me when we got the DVD as well. I think I came in with it at about episode 3, because what I first remember is Gary persuading Ron, proving to Ron that it was actually true. And of course Ron tries to go back with him down Duckett's Passage to 1940, and it doesn't work. And I always thought, oh, maybe it would work if Ron was touching Gary while Gary went back in time. But as is proved in a later series, when Gary tries to carry a child from the 1940s back to the 1990s, because he thinks this child is his lost nephew, he does have a good reason for doing so. The child can't go through, and thus we can be pretty sure it wouldn't have worked for Ron either. You mentioned the writers there. They are Lawrence Marks and Maurice Gran. They write it less and less as we go through, which has certain effects on the show and the quality of the show and the cohesion of the show. Their other big sitcom, we discovered last night when looking them up, was Birds of a Feather. Gary's treatment of Ron really is the best example of how he is an anti-hero, how he is very selfish and rather a user. He uses all the characters he interacts with in some way, but with Ron being in on the secret, he's very openly using Ron, and Ron doesn't really get a lot of care, support, friendship back from Gary in return. It's quite sad, really. Of course, the more the series goes on, the more Ron as a character unfortunately becomes portrayed as this sad bastard who's got nothing better to do than help Gary.
The bit that probably you're remembering and I'm remembering is where Ron has got arrested and put in prison for beating up someone who he's found with Stella. So at least it's not Gary's fault, unlike the time he was arrested for forging wartime currency. But this time, anyway, Gary's supposed to be helping him out, giving him emotional support, bringing bail money. Ron's happy to learn that Gary has come to see him, and in comes Gary beaming all over his face, announcing, "Phoebe and I are getting married," to which Ron responds, "I'm in the nick," which is very funny the way Victor Maguire delivers that line. From there, in Series 5 specifically, I think, they take it, these writers who aren't Morris and Lawrence mainly, take it too far. Gary really comes across as heartless and horrible to Ron. And I think they sort that out a bit in Series 6. Gary is nicer to Ron, But I think it's a shame that he really doesn't help Ron reciprocate, make the relationship more two-way, at least sometimes, because that would make him more likeable, wouldn't it?
It really would, particularly as Ron is the one person he can, practically, for the sake of the sitcom, have in on the secret.
It does remind me of Woof, a close friend who's in on it and helps you out with your supernatural ability.
So I suppose, really, Ron is Rachel rather than Roy, as he is a new friend who's very deep in this secret with you. Whereas we always imagined he was more like Roy than Rachel, Roy being Eric's lifelong best friend in Woof.
Thinking about Gary's bad points, of which there are many, reminds me of the Series 6 episode. One of those ones that are a bit bizarre, a bit more fantasy sci-fi than the earlier series, where Gary, on being struck by lightning by his umbrella, going through the time portal, is split into, as far as we can see, two people, Bad Gary and Ordinary Gary. Later on, for the very end, Good Gary appears for a couple of laughs, and he's been helping people out back in wartime, which does make sense because Gary, when he's all together, does sometimes want to help. But the premise of the episode, anyway, is that Bad Gary is sabotaging Gary's life, or perhaps not exactly sabotaging it, making of it what the bad side of Gary would like to. Plenty of nookie with both women, wallowing in being able to have these two wives. And another line from Ron that I enjoy is when he first sees Bad Gary, doesn't realise it's not ordinary Gary. Here's him saying rather insulting things about his wife's fit or what. And Ron's reaction is, "Why have you turned into Jeremy Clarkson?"
It is very funny, very comical, that episode. It's one of the more successful attempts to do something different as we get towards the end. It's the Series 6 opener to entice us to keep on watching to the end, and it is a good opener. You know, something they do in Series 5 once and Series 6 once, which isn't a very good idea and doesn't develop the premise in a good way, is actually get Gary onto the continent to join in with the war in Series 5 as a decoy double for his doppelganger, a French military officer, and in Series 6 in Belgium with Phoebe, with this troupe of entertainers.
Ensa, as they used to call it.
Including Bonnie Langford, playing a character, not herself, who accidentally end up in Nazi-occupied territory, and that one's very stupid, with Gary dressing up as Hitler. They certainly try out some new things. Some, like Gary splitting apart, are successful. Others, like Gary dressing up as Hitler, are not.
I did mention Stella, Ron's wife, who in Series 1 and 2 is only talked about. It's hard to remember specifically what Ron says. I think it's mainly Stella says she hates me doing this, and Stella says I shouldn't do that. And then she's introduced in person in Series 3, slagging off Ron, having real marital problems. And it's part of, I think, a slump, a struggle to think of storylines in Series 3. And you see Stella talking to Yvonne, complaining about Ron, talking about other men that she's been going with, and then it turns out that she hasn't. She's only been fantasizing and making out like it's true. And do we care? Well, the studio audience doesn't. That whole thing finishes up with, in Gary and Yvonne's house, Stella saying, "Oh, poor Ron, he's so hopeless, he needs me. I'm going to go back to him," and they kiss, and they obviously wanted a woo, but the audience is absolutely stone cold silent. Funnily enough, that whole episode left them completely cold. It's the George Formby episode. It's been a running gag that Gary finds George Formby irritating with his songs and his silly voice, gags at which the audience will politely chuckle. When an actor playing George Formby in a very overtly silly way is introduced, not one chuckle, polite or otherwise. And that episode really did fall very flat, and possibly the audience reaction made them think Ron's better, easier to use without Stella. Certainly we don't need her. So after that, she leaves him for real, and then he does become that sad bastard, and he loses his business about the same time as well. It gets bought up by a larger company. So poor Ron has a very unkind journey through the series.
Yes, he really does deserve better. But fortunately, Victor Maguire does always manage to get some humour out of him. I think it surprised me to read about how they'd done Birds of a Feather because of how they'd written Stella at times, Yvonne and Phoebe as well. They do have symptoms of men writing about women. And one thing we always noticed was everyone was happy enough to replace the women in Goodnight Sweetheart after Series 3 because it doesn't matter so much if they're not quite the same characters because they're only there to react to Gary, really. Whereas if you changed the men supporting characters, it would affect the show more because men are writing it. And I think that is a fair comment. The counterpart, as it were, of Ron, the other man that they really had to keep all the way through, is Reg, who was played by Christopher Ettridge. There are 3 early episodes he is in, 2 from the first series and 1 from the second. And as well as playing Reg in the 40s, he semi-regularly plays Reg's grandson in the 90s. And that's the character he actually first plays on screen. Gary meets Reg's grandson, the policeman, P.C. Deadman, who directs him down Duckett's Passage to try to get to this TV repair job he has, and he can't find the place, Hughgate's little house. And following Reg's grandson's directions, Gary stumbles through a time warp down Duckett's Passage back into 1940 and meets another P.C. Deadman, as well, of course, as Phoebe and her dad in the Royal Oak, and things go on from there, really.
His reaction to realising that it's actually the past and not a theme park is very funny. He's asking Phoebe how much for the beer, and she's saying, "Tuppence farthing." And he's like, "Come on, how much really?" "I told you, tuppence farthing." And then he has to go and have a bit of a think about what's going on. Next idea, of course, is that it's a dream. And I always think, well, at least he thinks he's dreaming when he claims to have written the first song from the future that he plays on the Royal Oak piano. Would he have turned round and said cockily, "Actually, I wrote it," if he didn't believe it was a dream? He certainly sustains that prodigal songwriter persona after he knows it's all real. It's all huge deception.
He kind of throws out, "Oh yeah, I'm a secret agent," at some point in Series 1, and really has to stick with that, as it's a very useful cover for why he's not in the war in uniform. He certainly weaves a tangled web without really meaning to, but he willingly gets tangled up in it in order to keep coming back and seeing Phoebe and escaping from aspects of his 90s life that he doesn't like. So it's all his own fault, really. They get some early humour out of Gary being out of time and not really realising what he's saying is going to be an anachronism, like when he's bought his costume in the second episode that we're so familiar with for long, his 1940s costume, and he's saying to Eric, Phoebe's dad, "Not bad for 25 quid." And of course Eric's like, 25 quid? They saw you coming, son. But then when they start having that sort of humour later, "I was going to give you 10 quid to paint the nursery red." Gary should be well past that by then, and that's again writers coming in off the street and messing about with it.
That one's particularly irritating because he starts by just saying 10, and Reg says, "I wouldn't take 10 bob off your son." And by that point, you don't believe in him correcting Reg. "Oh, I meant 10 quid. He knows, even if he forgot and said it by accident. Once Reg comes back with that, he'd be like, "Oh yeah, okay then, call it 5 bob."
I would have been disappointed if Christopher Ettridge hadn't returned for Series 4. Not to the same extent as if Victor Maguire hadn't, but it neatens things up. Ron and Reg are still the same. Yvonne and Phoebe aren't. And I do think Christopher Ettridge does manage to get quite a lot of humour out of the role. It's even more difficult for him, I think, than it is for Victor Maguire. Reg is very badly mistreated by the writers. He's one of these characters who gets stupider every year, gets stupider every episode sometimes.
I think there's a big descent into too stupid to be true. Right in the beginning of Series 3, it's another part of the Series 3 slump. He's suddenly saying things that obviously the studio audience realises they're meant to laugh at. Oh, stupid Reg, but they're not funny because they're too extreme.
Reg works damn hard during the war. He's a serving police constable. He's always out in the blackout patrolling, making sure people are all right. He helps Phoebe at the Royal Oak. He helps people with their little odd jobs, like doing their plumbing and things. They like to get jokes, the writers, out of it. Oh, he's not very good at it. Reg has had a go at that. Now it's even more broken than before. But goodness me, no one puts more effort into keeping the home fires burning than Reg Deadman. And he doesn't deserve all the ridicule he gets from the characters and the writers. It's a great shame. It's a bit like Back to the Future, the way Christopher Ettridge plays other members of Reg's family. I mentioned the grandson. We also meet Reg's grandfather in a later episode in the Royal Oak in 1888. And Reg says quite early on that his great-grandfather was one of the original peelers when the Metropolitan Police was first formed. So there's always been a PC Deadman in the East End of London. Bit of a gap between 1945 and about 10 years later, after Reg is forcibly retired, which really, again, he doesn't deserve. That's a few episodes into Series 6, before his son, Frankie, joins the Metropolitan Police. And that's one of the most interesting things about Reg, and one of the least selfish things Gary does, really, getting Reg together with his son, who he didn't know he had, and his eventual wife, Margie. And really, Reg and Margie and Frankie, Gary and Phoebe and Michael, their son, do become a nice family.
You said a little something earlier about inconsistencies between writers and scripts. A big one is, what are the rules of time travel? Is it predestination or not? And since you mentioned little Frankie and little Michael, between them they demonstrate very nicely that inconsistency. Compare how little Frankie gets his future. He has had it already when Gary meets Reg's grandson, who knows that Reg is his old granddad, and obviously has been in his life, which would not have been were it not for Gary's intervention. Whereas there is an episode at the end of Series 5, the very end, about Michael coming to Gary's shop where he sells wartime memorabilia. You can see how that would come about. As a down and out with a violent landlord who's going to beat him up if he doesn't pay the rent and all that. And Gary helps him out a bit in the present, but then of course goes back in time and sets up a trust fund for him. And when we see Michael again in the present, he's wearing a suit and has a successful career and family and all that kind of thing.
Talking about Frankie reminds me of one of the bits where Christopher Ettridge did manage to get quite a bit of humour out of something, which could have fallen very flat, where Reg is making a fort for little Frankie, and Gary's come up with this cover story. He's making a fort for his little nephew, and Phoebe's friend Violet is there, and Gary's saying, I've been telling Violet how you're making a fort for your nephew, Reg. And Reg is like, oh yes, my nephew, right you are. Well, it's the least I can do. After all, I am his dad. The way he just comes out with it like that is funny, but also it's making a joke out of, oh, isn't he stupid? I think at times Christopher Ettridge likes to try and make Reg less stupid by laughing after saying some of the stupid things, trying to say, well, Reg is joking here, actually. And I think he's right to do so, because, as you said, Reg is unbelievably stupid at times. But he does like a laugh as well, so I agree with Chris there.
In one episode, Victor Maguire also plays his own grandfather, Ron's grandfather, when Gary and Phoebe are off to Liverpool to see Phoebe's gran. And goodness me, that episode makes absolutely no sense. Ron has a newspaper clipping about how his grandfather saved a child from a fire in a warehouse. And Gary got Albert Wheatcroft arrested for theft. Turns out Ron's grandfather was a bit dodgy. And then he goes back to the present and has a Marty McFly experience with an altered timeline.
Everyone's much better off.
Including Ron, he's a priest, and waves to Gary saying,
"Yes, my son."
When Gary's like, Ron, and he seems quite happy. And Yvonne has a nice husband, we can only hope, and a couple of children. She was wanting children with Gary. But of course, Gary can't leave everyone to their better future. He has to go back in time and get Albert Wheatcroft to the warehouse, where he refuses to go in and save the child because he's not really good enough as a person, and Gary does it himself and restores the timeline. And if you think about that, you won't want to think about that for long. How the hell does that work? What the hell happened the first time, if there was a first time, which there must have been because the timeline changed?
Like Quantum Leap, you'd really struggle to rationalise an original timeline for everything that's presented, which can be quite annoying when you think about it, which inevitably will happen if you watch the thing a few times.
In that 1888 episode, I can see why they thought it would be a good idea, because it's in Jack the Ripper territory that the Royal Oak is, and the 40s half of the sitcom is set nearly all the time. I don't think it works terribly well, but I do think Reg's granddad is the most interesting thing, and he's very different from Reg and Reg's grandson. He's quite consistent with Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's idea of a copper. He doesn't really bother, he's corruptible, which may have come about such ideas from people like Conan Doyle's view of the working classes. Maybe it's not very accurate, but it's interesting to see a different type of P.C. Deadman. The other thing going on in that episode is a woman who looks exactly like Yvonne singing music hall and beginning an affair with Gary, which falls very flat, and there's nothing real feeling about that character. And the thing about Jack the Ripper being able to use the portal to go to Gary's present is very silly, really. And he disappears because he's run over by a lorry, which again makes you wonder, well, what are the rules of time travel?
Christopher Ettridge really gives that P.C. Deadman, Victorian P.C. Deadman, a very sinister edge. He goes as far as the script could possibly encourage him to, with making him almost evil. And I think he's enjoying there doing something a bit different, showing his range a bit. I think Victor Maguire quite enjoyed playing Ron's granddad. Bit of a criminal, bit of a wide boy. Not sinister, but certainly not a moral character. By the time we get to Series 5, one of the things they try to do with Reg is that awful joke where you give someone loads of funny middle names. Reg going on about how his full name is really this football team and Reg was the dog's name. It's not funny at all. You could say, and if you're going to acknowledge that scene, the best thing to say is that Reg is joking there. It's not very funny, but already twice before that point his full name has been established as Police Constable Reginald Horatio Deadman, which is much better, and perhaps is slightly amusing, not as amusing as Rodney Charlton Trotter from Only Fools and Horses, but that's the kind of level you want to take the middle name joke to. Boadicea Geraldine Granger is about as far as you can reasonably take it. I think Reg's best bits are slightly more serious bits, making Gary realise certain home truths, being rather the voice of reason, the disapproving voice of reason, just quietly but very accurately pointing out to Gary why he's mistreated Phoebe this time. You get a bit of that with Ron as well, explaining to Gary why he's a duplicitous egomaniac and how it's not fair on anyone, himself, Yvonne, or anyone in the past. Reg often calls Gary son, and in many ways that is kind of a grown-up, fatherly relationship. The trouble is, when they decide that Reg was born in 1901, it turns out that in terms of personal timelines, he's only actually 8 years older than Gary. And I think really Reg should be a little bit older than that. He's supposed to be in his 40s in 1940 when the show starts, rather than 39 at that stage. They really do that when they want to say Reg is still alive in the 90s. He's about to be 97 in 1998. And of course the only reason Gary goes to visit him in the nursing home is to try and find out, does old Reg know whether I was run over outside my Mayfair flat on this particular date? He may pat senile old Reg's knee sympathetically when it turns out he really has no idea what's going on, but I don't think he's going to bother going back and seeing him and supporting him in future. Phoebe's dad, Eric, was mentioned earlier. He's only in the first series, which consists of 6 episodes. He's played by David Ryall, who later played Grandad in Outnumbered and appeared in some other things as well. And he's really there as a barrier to Gary and Phoebe's relationship. The big barrier, of course, is that Phoebe is married and her husband Donald is away fighting the war. They don't really love each other. In some ways, that's supposed to mirror Gary and Yvonne, but to make the show sustainable, we can't keep saying, oh, Gary doesn't really love Yvonne. He'd really definitely rather be with Phoebe. He's got to be torn between them. I love you both. He's got to have both positive feelings and doubts about his relationships with both of them for the show to be sustainable. So after Eric's gone, there's still plenty of impediment to Gary and Phoebe. People talking about them carrying on and what have you when Donald's away fighting. But really, Eric is a big physical barrier to Gary and Phoebe really starting anything in the first series. And they kind of have to get rid of him for the second series for things to be able to move on. Of course, Gary saves Eric's life after he goes back up to the pub during the air raid to make sure no one's nicked his takings and ends up getting a knock on the head as a result of a nearby explosion. And Gary resuscitates him using CPR, which of course no one in 1940 is aware of. Reg finds Gary doing mouth-to-mouth resuscitation on Eric, and of course Reg's reaction is, "You animal!" and trying to stop him. But of course it works, and everyone's very impressed with Gary as a songwriter and a lifesaver. I was theorising this time that perhaps time or fate or God or whatever, as Sam Beckett might say, has reclaimed Eric by the start of Series 2. He was supposed to die in an air raid, and eventually, 6 months after Gary stopped it from happening the first time, it did happen. We were also wondering, when Phoebe had really bad pneumonia towards the end of Series 3, if, in the original timeline, if there was one, she had died at that point. She looked quite likely to. She was hospitalised and comatose, and really, if Gary hadn't brought back the penicillin to save her, the outlook looked very bleak for her. But rather than reclaim Phoebe at a convenient point, time or fate or God or whatever allowed her then to become pregnant and have a baby with somebody from the future, which reminded me of Clara from Back to the Future. Someone arrives from the future, saves the woman's life, and is then able to go on and have children with her that would never have existed without the time travel, but we might as well have time travel children now because this woman who was supposed to die in the past is alive, so what the hell, let's have some children out of it.
Rather the opposite of Lisa and No-Nose's children, who Sam Beckett prevented from being born.
I was enjoying some of the humour between Gary and Reg, with Reg reacting to things Gary had brought back from the future. Super glue to make Frankie's fault, and Christopher Ettridge did make that sort of reaction funny. I suppose that superglue thing may have inspired the longer scene where Gary leaves his wallet in the pub and Reg, in his official capacity as Constable Deadman, refuses to give it back to him until Gary's proved he can identify the contents of the wallet, and it's £50 notes with Queen Elizabeth II on them, which Gary has to pretend are German forgeries they're trying to flood the country with.
To make people think that the king is a transvestite. That could fall very flat, but it's funny the way Nicholas Lyndhurst delivers it and Christopher Ettridge reacts.
You'd think you might recognise Princess Elizabeth with a crown on, but I guess she looked too old. But really, I think the funniest bit of the scene is when Reg finds the condom conveniently rolled up in a handy-sized package in Gary's wallet, and he has no idea what it is, and Gary explains to him very tactfully it's a contraceptive, a sheath. And Reg is very surprised because he thinks those are huge, great things.
They're big and black and come in a box.
And Gary says quite proudly, not mine. And of course Reg takes that exactly the opposite way and comes out with, oh, well, never mind, son. Size isn't everything. And Gary's absolutely horrified by this. No, Reg, they fold up a lot. And of course Reg reacts like, yeah, of course they do, Gary. So that's the two of them getting the most humour possible out of that scene, which could have fallen very flat. Nicholas Lyndhurst, Victor Maguire and Christopher Ettridge do all have comedy skills that add to Goodnight Sweetheart, and Nicholas Lyndhurst does have chemistry with both those actors. There are varying degrees of chemistry that the four main actresses have with Nicholas Lyndhurst, and that's always something to consider when comparing Phoebe's and Yvonne's. It seems that after Series 3, Dervla Kirwan, who played Phoebe originally, decided to leave Goodnight Sweetheart. She then went on to do 3 series of Ballykiss Angel before deciding to leave that. It was a real policy she had, thanks to her agent, it seems, from her interview on the DVD, doing 3 series and then moving on. And I think in many ways she did want to stay and perhaps regretted it later.
She said in her interview that there was a certain amount of pressure on her and she does look back and kind of wish she'd stayed.
But I don't think it's unfair to infer that if one leg's going to get chopped off, let's chop off the other one to neaten it up. And so they got rid of Michelle Holmes as Yvonne. She played Yvonne for the first 3 series and replaced both the women. So it kind of seemed neat, planned.
That certainly is how it seems, and Michelle Holmes doesn't have an interview on the DVD to confirm or deny this. It's difficult to find anything that she said about her leaving, but I did find one print interview on the internet in which she said she was busy with some other show. I haven't heard of it, I'm afraid, Michelle, and I don't wish to sound like I'm saying, oh, whatever. I don't doubt that it was a factor, that she was busy with it. I do think, though, it's very likely that she was encouraged to leave Goodnight Sweetheart for the reasons that you just said.
I remember when it happened, there was some sense of, oh good, we could do with a new Yvonne in our house. I mean, it's not really Michelle's fault. Yvonne is written as one of these very sort of nagging wives, judgmental to Gary for him not making as much money as her or as much money as he should be making and that sort of thing. It's a difficult part to play in that way, but I do think Emma Amos, the second Yvonne, plays it much better. It really struck me when we were watching Series 4 this time. Emma Amos is funnier. She gets more humour out of lines where she's having a go at Gary than Michelle Holmes did manage. She at times makes the effort to seem like she likes Gary and finds him funny and does value their marriage, even though she finds him very frustrating in many ways.
I think also she comes second in the chemistry with Nicholas Lyndhurst competition. Michelle Holmes coming third, which tells you something about what we might say later.
She did the absolute worst line step ever towards the end of Series 3, Michelle Holmes, rivaling even Thomas Cromwell from the 70s. She trod on something Gary was saying halfway through, and it was even something he was repeating back to her, kind of amusingly, ironically, that she herself had said earlier. So she should have been quite familiar with the line. Not an offence that she deserves firing for in itself, but definitely the worst piece of line stepping in Goodnight Sweetheart. The attitude of Gary and the writers towards Yvonne and women in general who have a career and interest and open university is rather old-fashioned, and Gary feels quite at home in the 40s in many ways, quite reassured by how much Phoebe seems to need him. Yvonne doesn't need him, Phoebe does. I mean, perhaps the truth is, neither of them need him, but both of them want him, love him in some way, and the view he has of them as women is really more suited to a 1940s attitude.
A lot of how he feels about them comes from how they feel about him. And of course, he's absolutely deceiving Phoebe. She thinks he's this amazing war hero, spy, genius, songwriter. He brings her Cadbury's Dairy Milk and stockings and bananas and a pair of tights that she was tickled by. What is it? Quite enjoyed Dervla Cowan, who were coming to, delivering that. And really, he's taking advantage of his position as a time traveller to bring things from the future that he can pretend that he's created, got with more difficulty than he actually did. And he likes to be thought of in this way by not just Phoebe, but other people in the 40s. Bit of an egomaniac, you might say.
That's so true. He absolutely loves playing at being in the war and how people feed into this fantasy life he's created for himself. And when it starts to come apart at the seams at times, Gary himself comes apart at the seams. Reg sometimes has some very astute moments, like when Gary thinks he's trapped back in the past, but he isn't actually quite yet. And he's saying to Reg, oh, I can't get hold of these things for Christmas. The contacts are moving on. And Reg is like, well, the American embassy isn't moving on, is it? It's still there. And Gary's like, well, yeah, but I won't be able to get them anyway. It really threatens to all come tumbling down at the slightest thing. It's a very thin line he's walking with this subterfuge in the 40s, but he absolutely loves being able to do it. In that episode in Series 5 where it's all the dreams with all the main cast meeting each other in these dream sequences, and he's protesting about how difficult it is and how much he loves them both and he doesn't mean to deceive them and things. Ron in the dream says to him, well, you must like it though, stringing along two birds, and Gary's like, well, yeah, of course. That selfish, quite nasty, egotistical side to him is always there. I remember from the first time watching it in Series 2 when he tries to live in the 40s. He rents rooms in the local area and attempts to stay there with Phoebe forever from that point on, even though he's got 4 more years of war to go. He just can't hack it at all. He hates it. He can only play at it. And isn't it funny when he's complaining to Phoebe about the queues?
There's queues for everything. Are there really?
Phoebe is extremely unimpressed, and rightly so. She's been living with this situation for almost 2 years. Gary has seemed to be above it, which has kind of impressed her. Now he's whinging on at her, expecting her sympathy, and she's extremely unimpressed, and beginning to realise that Gary isn't quite what she's seen him as, and if he'd stuck around in the 40s, the scales would have completely fallen from her eyes.
Evidence there that she doesn't need him. She gets by very well in extremely difficult circumstances.
Like Reg, she's a real trooper during the war, and I suppose they're the embodiments of the spirit of the Blitz that got everyone through. In many ways, we admire Phoebe and Reg. We never admire Gary, however else we feel about him.
I was just thinking we respect him a bit more that time when he does admit his limitations. He's getting into a situation in the 40s and saying, I can't be a prisoner of war, I haven't got the inner resources. Whereas we have absolutely no respect for him going and trying to live in the 40s without thinking about what that would really mean.
He messes it up from the get-go. He's got Ron to drive him to Southwark Bridge to try and make it look like he's committed suicide. That doesn't work, fortunately for Gary. No one finds his clothes and his note. But of course he lets Ron drive off and then realises he hasn't got any modern money for the tube. So he has to walk all the way to Duckett's Passage. And the first thing he does when he turns up in 1941, ostensibly to stay forever, is complain to Reg about having to walk here all the way from Southwark.
Of course, Ron is very canny and predicts exactly what's going to happen. Gary is going to get sick of it very soon and come crying back to the 90s. Sums it up for Gary across the cafe table where he finds him, and Gary's like, how do you know? And Ron says, because that's exactly what I said would happen.
Surprised to see me? Not really.
Yes.
Ron has Gary absolutely pegged. I mentioned Ron's first attempt to go back in time. It's not his last either. He's pretty keen on checking it out, seeing what it's like, and very understandably so, with all helping Gary and hearing his stories.
Before he actually manages it in a series 5 episode where there's been a bomb in Duckett's Passage and the time portal's all screwy for a couple of episodes, I counted 3 attempts. That first one. The second one is when they're doing the building work, the development of Duckett's Passage, which we haven't really mentioned, but it does lead to this shop where, in fact, Gary has his own personal time portal out the back. And they're going through the mobile offices, and there's a security guard after them, and Gary jumps into the time portal from upstairs, and Ron, in an attempt to evade the security guard, thinks, well, maybe this is it, maybe I can go back, and then we get a very amusing POV shot from the top of this mobile unit of him lying in the rubble, looking up at this guard and saying, it'll be nice when it's finished, won't it?
That's one of Victor Maguire's very funnily delivered lines. Could be a quite innocuous or quite flat line, but he makes it really funny.
The other attempt is one of those times when they're in the yard at the back of the shop. Gary goes through.
It's when Gary thinks Yvonne's nephew has used the portal, but actually he hasn't, and Ron theorises with the innocence of a child you could pass through the portal, and so he decides to try it himself. I will have faith, I will go back.
Crashes his nose into the gates, of course, and not for the last time.
No, Yvonne, don't look.
The reason being that Ron has been back that time, done what Gary is guilty of, tried to big himself up, messed it up by taking it too far, going on about German cars and Japanese electronics and what have you, and he's in the yard with Gary saying, why did you bring me back? I was happy there, I was somebody. And I commented, he'll have to find some new people and try again because he totally lost the respect of Gary's bunch. But then when he attempts to go back, the portal has closed for all but Gary. And possibly little Michael, who does come through at one point.
In the first episode of Series 5, and yes, there hasn't been a bomb or anything to disrupt the portal at that time. Although a bomb has gone off nearby, and Gary has rushed down Duckett's Passage with Michael, thinking that the time portal is the best means of escape, even though it may not actually have been affected by the bomb at that stage. So perhaps Michael can pass through any time he wants. Very luckily so. Gary's taking rather a chance there. I did like that scene when it was first on in Series 5 where Phoebe and Yvonne actually meet. Yvonne thinks Phoebe is some kinky date of Ron's who can only be sexually aroused by pretending it's the Second World War. Phoebe thinks Yvonne is Gary's boss, Yvonne Goolagong, the head of his department in the Secret Service. And the conversation they have doesn't go very far, but it works out okay with them both thinking that. It's a fun little scene, but it's an extra stage of surreal than we've had before that point. And I always think it wouldn't have worked so well having Dervla and Michelle meet. I don't think I'd be as ready to accept it as Liz and Emma. I don't think it would really work, particularly for Dervla's version of Phoebe. And really, Dervla Kirwan playing Phoebe is one of the very good things about the first 3 series of Goodnight Sweetheart. She's very real. Rather like David Suchet's Poirot and Christopher Reeve as Superman. It's a real piece of transformation into a character, not with false moustaches and padding like with Poirot, but she's extremely convincing in bringing Phoebe to life. She's Irish, of course, but it never seems like she's pretending to be this East End girl. It really seems like she's Phoebe. She's very funny at times, showing Phoebe's different moods and reactions to things. In that case, come over here.
You talked about Gary's lodgings that he got when he tried to live in the 40s. Phoebe's very impressed with the mod cons. Oh, you've got a mangle.
We absolutely love that, but you've got a mangle. She's so impressed. And when she's going to visit her young cousins who've been evacuated, Gary goes with her in the end, and that's where they end up consummating their their relationship in a barn in the countryside, ever such a long way away, Phoebe thinks, Buckinghamshire, which I'm sure I thought was terribly funny at the time because I was very keen on learning the counties, and I was well aware that Buckinghamshire is one of the counties that borders Greater London, where Phoebe lives.
I remember watching that not a long, long time ago on the BBC, but on ITV3. They're looking for the house they're going to, and Phoebe said, I think this map must be out of date, Gary. I thought, he hasn't brought a modern map to 1941, has he? And then she says, M25, what's that? And it's like, oh no, he has. He's got so used to things from the future being more than sufficient, I suppose. But you should think a bit more carefully about maps and that kind of thing, Gary.
And that's the kind of level of surreality that Dervla's Phoebe can reach. I don't think I'd like to see her in Gary's shop in the late 90s meeting Yvonne. I think that would take me too far out of really believing in the character. So in some ways, The New Women does allow the show to do a bit more, explore a bit more, become a bit more surreal. And in many ways, I suppose it kind of needs to sustain so many episodes. It has quite long series. The first one is 6 episodes, standard BBC sitcom series. But then you get 10-episode series after that. There's also a Christmas special between series 2 and 3. So I think losing Dervla as Phoebe does take away some of the real feeling of the show, but at the same time allows it to have more shelf life by taking the already sci-fi surreal concept even further. Not that there is anything wrong with Elizabeth Carling. As you were saying, she does have the least chemistry with Nicholas Lyndhurst out of all the main cast, which is a bit of a shame, but she does make us laugh regularly. She's certainly not a bad addition to the show. She's just not Phoebe, or at least not the same Phoebe as the Phoebe from the first 3 series, whereas I can accept Emma Amos's Yvonne as a continuation of the same character, perhaps in some ways a better version of the same character.
I said to you when we were watching the series and it was getting towards the end of series 3, I find it hard to visualise Elizabeth Carling in the Royal Oak. I know she must be there sometimes. And of course she is, particularly in series 4, which we must suppose was written with Dervla Kirwan in mind. Later on, stuff like being in the shop in the present, it's written for Liz, and that's when we get the laughs out of her mostly. You have to write for her, and you have to dress her, and you have to arrange her hair, and you have to really adapt the character for it to suit that actress. In series 4, not only is Liz Carling in the Royal Oak quite a lot, but she's got the same sorts of costumes that Dervla Kirwan used to wear, and they don't suit her. And they've tried doing her hair like Dervla Kirwan's, which also doesn't suit her. It feels all wrong. It looks weird, her being there saying Dervla Kirwan's lines. And she does what she can with it. I noticed that she speaks very well to Reg. She's very sort of gentle and humorous with him when he's being a bit thick. She will gently correct him and have a little chuckle, which I thought was a nice interpretation of those sorts of things. But evidently, whoever decides these things agreed with me. They change her hair and they get clothes that suit her and she looks much better, and they also keep her out of certainly the bar of the Royal Oak quite a lot. They put her and Gary upstairs in the flat more, and then they go as far as finding them another flat in the West End after that first bomb from which Michael and Gary escaped through the time portal. Gary's able to persuade Phoebe, let's go and live in the West End, where they're not going to, where they're not likely to bomb, and she agrees. And from there they've got a new setting, their flat, and they even, very near the beginning of Series 6, lose the tenancy of the Royal Oak, and Gary rents a nightclub for them. And that's really the reason they retire Reg, so that he can go and be the doorman at the flat and help out in the club as well.
Yes, I think we both quite enjoyed the first two episodes of Series 5, where Liz Carling was really coming into her own as the new Phoebe. She was being allowed to do so because it had been written for her. We see her occasionally in the Royal Oak, sometimes downstairs, until the third episode of Series 6, I think it turned out to be. We see the inside of the Royal Oak for the last time in episode 5 of that series, in Victorian times. But they were good, those first two episodes of Series 5, moving into the flats, getting one over on the snooty butcher, Gary and Phoebe pretending to be posh and conning him out of his roadkill venison from Windsor Park. They played that scene very comedically, putting on their funny posh accents. Just a moment, my dear. Why, yes. And you get Noel Coward introduced in that whole sequence as well. David Benson is the actor / impressionist who plays Noel Coward in Series 5 and 6, and I do like him as an addition to the show. Quite surreal to have him in there as a recurring character. But he's so nice and fun and genial to Gary and Phoebe, and he's such a good neighbour to them, giving Phoebe her singing lessons and babysitting Michael. I think he's a very good character to have in the show, and adds to that extra sense of surreality that helps to give the show a whole new feel with the whole new women.
What they end up doing with Yvonne is rather surreal as well. I find it disappointing. I was thinking about her hair as well, actually. She does Series 4, Emma Amos, with her own hair, straight hair, which is different from the hair that Michelle Holmes had, which was shorter and curly. And Emma Amos's own hair suits her. And while they let Liz Carling have her own hair for Series 5 and 6, because the style didn't suit her before, they do the opposite to Emma. They curl it, shorten it, and I don't think it suits her as well. And they take the character in a direction that I don't like. I'd be much more interested in the storyline that they set up at the end of Series 4, where she's going into business with this person called Clive. They're launching Nature Boy, this series of natural beauty relaxation products, or so Yvonne thinks. But then she's telling Ron in the shop they're confiding in each other. Ron's business has been taken over. She tells him Clive's done a runner. Previously, in their kitchen in Cricklewood, she's been on the phone trying to pin down Clive, and Gary comes in distracted with Phoebe having the baby and what have you, and you said he hasn't noticed she's on edge, she's so self-absorbed. Clive's done a runner, but then, start of Series 5, actually he hasn't, and they have done their business, and Yvonne's a millionaire now. And that is because Yvonne not needing Gary to that extent is, as you call it, their exit strategy. She has, first of all, this successful business with Clive. She then sells him her half for £15 million. And she's making all these public appearances. It's an absolutely stupid thing about making a giant perspex figure of her for the Millennium Dome. She gets ennobled, becoming Baroness Yvonne. And at best, I think, it stops Yvonne from being believable, a real feeling character. And at worst, there are a couple of ways you could look at this. One of which is she doesn't get the man, but to make up for it, she gets £15 million and ennobled and celebrity friends and all sorts of things, because that's equal to being married to a man. The other way of looking at it is having all these things affects her perception of Gary. He starts to feel not good enough. You were saying earlier that they might both want and love him rather than need him, but now the perception is that Phoebe needs him and Yvonne doesn't, and I find that rather unpalatable. Given that he did have to end up with Phoebe from the moment that Yvonne miscarried her baby and Phoebe didn't in Series 4, I'd much rather that he'd left Yvonne with an ordinary life, an ordinary job, a comfortable income, friends that make her happy, all the things really that she had before.
God, Gary really does like to have his cake and eat it too, doesn't he? Yvonne being so busy, going off, jetting around the world, making money in Series 5 and 6, suits him really well, because he wants to go off and be with Phoebe. And yet he complains about it. He wants them both to be hanging around, needing him, wanting him to be there even when he's not. when Yvonne, when she's Michelle Holmes, confesses to him she's been having this kind of emotional affair with someone else. They've talked about deep things and held hands in the restaurant, and Gary's reaction is, Yvonne, how could you? And then, of course, Nicholas Lyndhurst reacts in his face, and Gary has one of these moments of self-realization. Well, I'm much worse than that, aren't I? So he starts being nice to Yvonne and forgiving her, and they talk through it together. I sometimes think Gary and Yvonne's marriage is quite sad, really, because there are signs that they're really very fond of each other. They've had a good time together in the past, but they'd now be better off as friends who occasionally catch up over a chat, rather than two people struggling to have this kind of pointless marriage that they both find rather difficult, particularly when Gary starts time travelling and philandering, and doesn't really, at least on a regular basis, make either of them happy. And I suppose it's why I always thought he should end up with Phoebe. I didn't think he had a very good marriage with Yvonne, and overall, for whatever reason, changing reasons throughout the series, but perhaps a root reason of they just got married because it was the next thing to do and they didn't really actively want to. It is the right thing that he ends up with Phoebe and Michael in the past. And as you say, when Series 4 was first on, it became obvious, right, he's going to end up with Phoebe whenever this does finish, and not be able to come back to the present, the future, the late 90s, because he's got Michael there. That thing about Michael being grown up and Gary changing the timeline to give him a better life at the end of Series 5 seems to me to indicate that they weren't quite sure if they were going to get their sixth series, and that was going to serve as a kind of ending to the show. The script of that one gives us quite an inconsistency. It depends on Gary still being able to go back and forth and bring Michael transistor radios, but mainly be out of his life after the war, and of course that's not going to happen. I was pleased at the end of Series 6 when he did end up with Phoebe and Michael, and Reg and Margie and Frankie for good, although Lawrence and Morris felt they had to come up with this excuse for him going back in time in the first place to save the life of Clement Attlee. There's an assassination attempt on him at the V-Day celebration, and after Gary's done that, he's fulfilled his destiny and he's stuck in the past forever. And to have him say, that's why I was sent back at 93, this is the reason I've been hanging around for 6 years, making this whole life in the past just so I can do that, it doesn't really wash, I think.
I don't happen to like things like that, sudden explanations for what's been established, and they're never going to make enough sense. Rather like prequels such as The Magician's Nephew, trying to explain things that have just been established as that's the way things are. I think it's Quantum Leap, where a character says sometimes that's just the way things are is the best explanation. That is so true.
Yes, it turned out to be Al the bartender in that stupid final Quantum Leap. Awful in almost every way, that finale, but that line is very, very true.
What the writers wanted, and they admitted this on one of their comments, was a reason for Gary to be stuck there, no longer to have the option to go back. You were saying you'd rather that he had decided to stay with them.
Yeah, there's no reason not to, really, after the war, but it takes the time portal closing for him to admit, this is enough cake for me. This is where I belong with you, Phoebe and Michael.
There is an episode in which he has already made that decision, where he thinks the time portal is going to close. Now, it's another one that I find rather silly, time portal police kind of thing, and there's a time portal here and a time portal there, and Ron trying to strike a business deal with a character from quite a way in the future. I think that was taking it a bit far, but the interesting thing was that Gary thought his portal was going to be closed, and he chose to go and be with Phoebe and little Michael and try and tie up loose ends in the 90s.
He says to Michael, you were what made the difference, you know. And I think, well, I always liked Phoebe more than Yvonne anyway, and I thought you did too. I suppose early on when I was getting interested in it, he did.
Of course, poor Phoebe does get shoved into the trap of sour-faced old nag at times, because that seems to be what very often happens to sitcom wives.
I really thought when it was first on, that episode with the guy from the future might be a kind of backdoor pilot for a series with Victor Maguire and Tom Goodwin Hill being Ron and another time traveller, which I thought at the time might be rather fun. But no, it was knocked on the head. The guy's time portal was closed immediately. That was the one that was really going to be closed, not Gary's. The final time we see Duckett's Passage used properly without having redevelopment all over it and Gary making the workman think there's a ghost when he comes back is the 4th episode of Series 2, which is the 3rd and last episode without Reg, which I mentioned the premise of earlier. Gary's trying to have a meal with Phoebe and a meal with Yvonne on the same night, except 53 years apart, and he's rushing backwards and forwards between the two, getting terrible indigestion, losing Ron money by doing a terrible underquote to the restaurant he's at with Yvonne to print up some leaflets for them. Yvonne thinks he's incredibly ill. He keeps rushing to the toilet for ages. Actually, he's with Phoebe. I'm sure in the original BBC broadcast he left a tape of music playing in the toilet to suggest that he was in there singing, and by the time he got back from the 40s it had turned into Pavarotti, making it seem like Pavarotti was in the toilet of this Indian restaurant, which I thought was terribly funny at the time. But I don't think they could get the rights to include that song or Pavarotti at all in the ITV3 broadcast or the DVD release, which says as seen on ITV3 on it, and it turns into this kind of electric music beat instead, which isn't nearly as funny as Pavarotti's in the toilet. But that episode is very comical and amusing, and it's unfortunate to think, really, this is the last time we see Gary running back and forth along Duckett's Passage, instead of disappearing into a time portal using an effect, which starts towards the end of Series 2 with that building site stuff that I was describing, and continues throughout.
Nicholas Lyndhurst does have some testimonial on the DVD. It's not a recent interview looking back. It's some publicity thing that they videoed at the time, and he's in the set at the Royal Oak, if I remember rightly, telling somebody. It's not like other time travel things where there's a load of flashes and effects and what have you. I literally walked down one end of the passage in 1993 and emerged on the other side in 1940. And I'm not sure from the tone of his voice if he thinks that's a good thing or a bad thing or just a thing. I think it's a good thing. I think it's very effective to use Duckett's Passage like that. And I think it's a shame to stop. On the one hand, it works quite well that he's got the portal out the back of his shop and you kind of can't mix that with Duckett's Passage as it was. I think really they did it though because they had the budget and they wanted an effect and they wanted it to look cool. I don't know, I may be wrong. The trouble is that they start messing about with effects at the other end and you get Gary appearing out of thin air at one point, or at least at one point, not even in Duckett's Passage, but near it, making Reg jump. Come on, where'd you spring from? Well, if he'd just come out of the passage like usual, that wouldn't have been such a surprise, would it? So what do? They build a wall there after the bomb damage. First of all, when Gary's checking to see if the portal has reopened when Phoebe's trapped on the wrong side, he sticks his hand through the wall that forms the side of the passage and surprises the policeman who's standing there. And then later on, it stops looking like a passage. It looks like a sort of courtyard. And he walks into this wall. It seems that they've rebuilt and altered Duckett's Passage since the bomb damage, made it useless as a passage. By 1993, it's going to be unblocked and become a passage again, and it's very difficult to see how that comes about, especially seeing the state of it in the 60s, which we'll get to soon, I should think.
As you say, it is good for him to have private access to his time portal out the back of his shop. And I remember thinking when it was first on, oh yeah, well I suppose this is going to work. He's got his shop now and he can pop back and forth, and I guess that's just as good, almost as good in some ways, as Duckett's Passage. I always thought he should make some money out of selling memorabilia, particularly after he loses his driving licence and, as a direct result, his job, being a travelling TV repairman, aerial satellite dish installer sort of person. That would be a great way for him to make money, and he ends up opening a shop and making a good living out of it. He starts the whole process with records, doesn't he? Realising he can bring back mint condition records and sell them to collectors.
First pressing of Frank Sinatra and that kind of thing. And he said at one point he should do more of that and he'd make a mint.
And he ends up doing it with all sorts of things. Free maps from the buses, things he can buy in the local area, teapots, stamps, that sort of thing. And tries to make some really serious specialised money in rare stamps, or stamps that have become rare by the 90s. And watches he tries at one point. It's a little gold mine for him. And if that was the most duplicitous, slightly morally questionable thing he was doing, he'd be much less of an anti-hero than he is.
I like the name of the shop, Bits and Pieces. You have to read it off the front. If you want to know that, they only ever refer to it as the shop. Another line of Ron's I enjoyed was all to do with the time portal in the back. He was telling Gary he should be helping to unload the van. Gary says, I can't help unload, I'll disappear into 1941, won't I? And Ron says, I've heard some excuses in my time. That is an unusual one, certainly, but very true.
Got another example of how Ron is doing everything to help Gary, delivering the shelves for his new shop.
Again, I'm thinking some gratitude at the very least, and sometimes when he needed some support for Ron would be a good thing to have in the show, and it's a shame not to.
So on the whole, I think the shop is a good thing, and it should be a part of the show, and it's a good location to keep using. Convenient for Gary to have the portal right there, but it's a shame to lose Duckett's Passage and the effect of just walking back and forth along it. So I think in an ideal world, there'd be the shop and Duckett's Passage. The shop would be nearby, wouldn't necessarily have to be in a new urban development over the top of where Duckett's Passage used to be.
The name of which is Duckett's Plaza. They always remember that name and pay homage to it.
Including as Duckett's Village in the thing we're going to talk about after, remembering to mention the few guest stars that we just wanted to give a shout out to. Michael Troughton from Time Busters plays a character called George Harrison, and that is a joke that Lawrence and Morris like sometimes, and I don't think it's really funny in itself.
What is quite funny is Yvonne Goolagong, and in the thing that we're going to mention after this bit, I'm Gary Lineker. We know those names and the people in the past don't, and Gary's making them up, but to say they just happen to have the same name as someone we've heard of, where's the humour there? I don't think that's funny.
This character, George Harrison, played by Michael Troughton, he's from the brewery, and he's got this sleazy plan about getting Phoebe to pay him in kind for not moving a family into the pub and ending her tenancy. So he's not a very nice character, and I think Michael Troughton does a convincing job as this sleazy, despicable, corrupt person in a position of power. That character works very well, better than Professor McNulty in many ways, I think. I quite like that episode in that it uses the time travel in an inventive way. Gary brings back a micro cassette recorder from the future to get Michael Troughton's character saying sleazy, indecent things on, to thus blackmail him into not kicking Phoebe out of the pub. Phoebe and Reg are impressed by the micro cassette recorder. Nice use of the time travel there. But it's mentioned in the end, when we get to Series 6, that George Harrison from the brewery has at last followed through on his threat. But that's okay, we don't want to do anything about it this time. It's time in the show's narrative to move away from the Royal Oak and have the nightclub instead, so George Harrison can do what he wants. The other guest star I promised we'd mention is Roger Sloman, who's in absolutely everything, including the Vicar of Dibley, I forgot to mention on the Update podcast, as the water board official who wants to turn Dibley into a reservoir. He plays Gary's dad, whose name is George.
I don't like that character. His role is one that makes me be absolutely on Gary's side when I think the writers actually don't mean me to be. George turns up all like, oh, hello, Gary, I've come to see you. I want you to do this with me. I want you to do that with me. Gary says, well, actually, I was planning on, and he comes up with some excuse, memorabilia fair or something, which is his go-to. Of course, really, he wants to go and be with Phoebe while Yvonne's away. And George is acting all hurt and,
can't you postpone it, son?
Like, I'm entitled. I've just turned up on your doorstep. You have to spend time with me. I can't stand that attitude. And I wish Gary wouldn't rearrange his plans with Phoebe and cause himself all kinds of trouble, but he does.
The particularly memorable bit I find with Gary and his dad is one of these things where the script oversells something that someone is saying that turns out not to be quite what the other character thinks it is. George is talking about how he was doing a job in the 60s in the East End, went down an alleyway, and it struck him how much it looked like Victorian times. The way he first tells this story, it makes Gary think his dad has actually walked down Duckett's Passage in the 60s and really ended up in Victorian times. And of course, when Gary comes out with, I can do it too, I can go back in time like you did, his dad's all like, what are you talking about? You said you could go back in time. I said it was like going back in time. If it wasn't for the TV aerials, I'd have believed it was Victorian London. And yet, at the beginning of the scene, Roger Sloman has had to completely oversell that so that Gary will think his dad's really gone back in time.
Still haunts me today, I seem to remember.
I mean, you wouldn't say that about just seeing an old-looking part of London, would you? You'd say it about actually thinking he'd step back in time. In 2016, the BBC had a sitcom season where they were showcasing some new sitcoms and also making special new episodes of some old sitcoms with the option of perhaps picking some or one of them up as a series. What ended up getting picked up was a new version of Porridge with Kevin Bishop, and the others, like Are You Being Served, set in the late 80s with different actors playing the same characters, didn't get picked up. And that includes the 2016 reunion special of Goodnight Sweetheart, with the right actors playing the right characters 17 years later. It could have worked as a continuation of the series, but it's not a great shame that it didn't get picked up. However, it is interesting and at times amusing to watch as a special reunion episode.
I enjoyed it, and really that's because, now that I'm old, I'm with these rather old-fashioned writers. Sitcoms do, I think, have a tendency to poke fun at anything new, anything that the rather behind-the-times writers don't understand. And this time, it's all the things that are new-ish in 2016, primarily smartphones and tablets and what have you, to which Gary reacts kind of similarly to us, but it's more extreme because, of course, he's been in the past. He comes back from the 60s, which is why I mentioned the 60s earlier. There's this metal sheeting with posters on blocking Duckett's Passage. But of course, if he wasn't trapped in the past, that reunion special, that kind of humour, wouldn't have worked. We've talked about Nicholas Lyndhurst's extraordinary talent for comedy reactions. Gary emerging into 2016, seeing tablets and smartphones and selfie sticks, trying to attract people's attention, and they've got various types of headphone on. Seeing a couple of guys walking down the street holding hands and kissing. His reaction to that is all very, very funny. We haven't mentioned the sort of casual homophobia. It was the norm in the 90s, and hats off to Lawrence and Morris for saying, well, that's how it was. We weren't the ones to question it and think of changing it, and now it has changed, and Gary's surprised.
They're absolutely right to do so, and Gary does demonstrate a lot of casual homophobia in the 90s. He's got on with this guy who was going to be one of a pair of guys who was perhaps going to buy Gary and Yvonne's house. And Gary just wouldn't have it from Yvonne that they were a gay couple. No, you can't be. You like this certain type of music, and I got on with him. Of course, Gary does have his humanising a homosexual moment when he talks to Donald, and it turns out one of the reasons that Donald and Phoebe's marriage isn't so successful is because Donald is really gay and wanted to open a sheep farm on Australia with the man he was really in love with. And Gary finds this very affecting. Donald's like, I guess there's something wrong with me. And Gary's like, no, there isn't. So we can see at heart he's not someone who hates homosexuals, but it makes absolute sense that his reaction to the gay couple in 2016 is as it is. And what about those phone boxes? That's a really funny bit.
Yes, going over to these red phone boxes. There aren't telephones in them. He opens one, there's an ATM. Second one along with a defibrillator. Third one, there's all this coffee machine and cups and things. And a bloke comes up to him saying, yes, mate.
And Gary thinks he'll find some sanity by going into a mobile phone shop, Of course, he finds the guy in there vaping, talking about smartphones, getting someone trying to call him on his watch.
Telling Gary he doesn't have to have a smartphone, what he calls a dumb phone, if all you want to do is talk to people, and to people that character's age. It is a huge joke now that you would just want to talk to people on your phone, but we absolutely get why Gary would think that's an extraordinary thing to say.
And of course what he was trying to do was phone Ron. He finds himself back in that present. He immediately wants to turn to Ron for help. I remember when that was going to be on, theorising, might they pick and choose their women for this? Elizabeth Carling and Emma Amos are in it, which is right, really, because they took over the roles. They should have first refusal of continuing them. I remember saying I would like to see Derbla Kirwan and Emma Amos, and I think that would have worked all right. Would have done a disservice to Liz Carling, though. Although putting Phoebe back in the Royal Oak, which is rather annoying. I mean, you can say, yes, Gary and Phoebe have bought it back in the past 17 years. They own that, and the Mayfair flat, and the nightclub. But really, just having the main scenes in the 60s, Phoebe, Reg and Michael knocking about in the Royal Oak with no explanation is rather annoying and anomalous. And it perhaps would have seemed less anomalous to see Derbla in there.
Getting rid of the Royal Oak was quite a drastic step. I do think it was changing Phoebe's that made them want to get rid of it. I think otherwise they would have never got rid of the Royal Oak, and this kind of proves it, really. They needed it back, somebody felt, for this reunion special.
And had the series been picked up, we would very much have wanted to see an explanation of why they're back in the Royal Oak, and we could have accepted it. It's Phoebe's childhood home. She's very fond of it, or at least she was when she was Derbla. We'd want to hear that Michael did end up with a little sister like Phoebe wanted, and she'd been at boarding school or something during that episode. And I really couldn't accept that Phoebe and Reg would keep being so oblivious to the truth about Gary's time travelling as you get things like more and more Beatles songs coming out. And it occurred to me, not long before recording this podcast, it would be interesting if Reg's role in that series was to clock it. It's already kind of started. He's the one who recognises Love Me Do from the opening on the harmonica that Michael plays. That's one of your dads. And as Reg hears a few more Beatles songs and Gary starts sneaking off to a different time period again, reminding Reg of the war and how it made Phoebe feel. And as Reg thinks about the condom and the £50 notes and the vintage 1997 champagne and the coffee that was best before 1995, it should all fall to place in his brain, which he does have, despite what some writers may think. And he could be Gary's kind of new Ron, new confidant, although he wouldn't really like keeping it from Phoebe, would he? In Gary's main time period where he mainly lives, because that now would be the 60s, and he'd be popping back and forth from the teens, which would be his kind of pretend life. What reason would he have to do that? Yvonne doesn't really want him there, why would she? She knows all about it and finds seeing him and talking to him very difficult, distressing and annoying.
As Yvonne says to him, go back to your family, Gary, there's nothing for you here. And then Ron, who is also there, says,
that's not quite true, Yvonne. And in walks Yvonne's daughter, Ellie, played by Emma Amos's real-life daughter, Esme. And that's what ties Gary to the present. As it turns out, for this new show, potential new show, Yvonne, of course, has to have been pregnant when Gary was stuck in the past, and had their daughter, so that Gary has a reason to be coming back and forth.
Another laugh we got out of it was Gary not realising Ellie is his daughter, and we're thinking, oh, they always do this. Gary says, you mean she's our daughter? And Yvonne very quickly knocks on the head any emotional resonance. Well, of course she is, you plank.
Which is good, and it makes us laugh, because it would kind of be insulting to the viewers to think we didn't know that by that stage, just from TV tropes in general and from what Ron said.
A continuation of what they did with Yvonne that I wasn't happy with, as I was explaining, is that of course she can't be a proper mother to Ellie, have a good relationship with her. She's been expelled from various boarding schools and what have you. She's come back basically for a shouting match with Yvonne.
Just to press her buttons, really, because she's been having a study day and then is going to go back to school. They don't have a very good, honest relationship at all. When I first heard Gary's assessment of himself to Ellie, of course Ellie doesn't realise he's talking about himself at that point. He's talking about your dad. We were around at the same time in Yvonne's life. He says something like he was a bit self-obsessed and
immature,
but basically a good guy. And I used to think, oh yes, I suppose that's true about Gary, really. But watching the show a few times on DVD since then, I've really gone off Gary. I think he's absolutely morally reprehensible. And the way his entire life with Phoebe is a lie. At their wedding reception, his speech is a song that he just says. It's nothing from the heart at all, and yet Phoebe gives him all the heart she has.
I think the writing is ungenerous to all the characters at some point, which has kept coming up. And I think it's one of those things where what really makes it work is the cast. Poor Ron has been treated badly by the writing of that reunion special. He's living in Yvonne's basement in exchange for odd jobs like a bit of driving, and he's driving her home from being a dragon in Dragon's Den. When Gary comes across him, he's found out from the guy in the mobile phone shop that Yvonne's like a dragon in it, and she wasn't easy to live with. And of course, Ron's reaction is amazement, some pleasure at seeing Gary, and of course he starts to ask for an explanation, and the writers, quite rightly, don't want to bore the viewers with what we've already seen, so Ron interrupts the explanation with, it doesn't matter, it never made sense anyway, which is another sort of meta comment about how these time travel things, when you think about it, you really probably shouldn't think about it. Gary holding himself as a baby on the day that he's born somehow propels him into where he would be if he'd carried on living in his own time.
And there were a couple of funny bits there with the younger George Sparrow.
That's whom Gary introduces himself to as Gary Lineker, by the way.
And we did like Gary offers his father the Mint Imperial. George eats the Mint Imperial. Fully aware of the context of the situation, Gary asks him, is this your first? Obviously meaning, is this your first baby? And George replies, yeah, I normally buy polos. Yes, I don't think it can be denied that Gary and Ron do develop a kind of emotional closeness through the whole thing, just from being in this kind of intense, unusual situation together. It's an unconventional but quite a deep friendship in the end, despite the fact that Gary does take terrible advantage of Ron. In Series 2, when Gary's thinking he's going to be in the past forever and saying goodbye to Ron for the last time, Ron won't hug him, print as a manly bloke, settle for a handshake, but they do hug quite a lot later on. When Gary's planning to go back when he thinks the time portal's going to close, they have quite an emotional goodbye, which kind of carries over to when Gary gets stuck unintentionally a few episodes later. And Ron is very pleased to see Gary in the new special in 2016, says he's missed the whole thing of helping Gary to have a double life in 2 time periods.
It's probably one of those things where you forget the bad bits and how bad they were.
He looks back at it with rose-tinted glasses because it did make his life interesting. And there we have everything you could ever possibly want to hear us say about Goodnight Sweetheart. Hopefully you'll join us again next time, which will be the final Sunday in April. As we say, hopefully everything you'll ever want to hear us say about
Drop Dead Fred.
A movie this time. It is a movie with plenty of interesting things to say about it. Until then, good night out there.
Whatever you are.